the Falkland Islands, an archipelago with over 700 islands, which is located about 500 kilometers from the South American mainland. Nevertheless, the islands do not belong to nearby Argentina. No, they belong to the United Kingdom until today. For centuries, the British and Argentinians have been fighting over this archipelago of islands. In the 1980s, even a war began between the two countries, which ended in an invasion by the British and resulted in numerous deaths. And even today, the dispute over the islands continues to lead to disputes between the two countries. But how did the British manage to conquer the islands which are located so far from home in the first place? Why do they want to keep them at all costs, and why might the conflict boil up again today? Let's take a look at all these questions in today's video. The first recorded landing in the Falkland Islands did not occur until 1690. British Captain John Strong charted the islands and conducted research, but it would be nearly 100 years before they were taken possession of. In 1765, the British Crown claimed the islands as its official property and sent a naval expedition to the Falkland Islands. The expedition founded the first settlement, Port Egmont, which was to serve as an important naval base. In addition, the immigration of the first British settlers was encouraged. In fact, however, they were not the first settlers on the islands. A year earlier, 75 French colonists had already settled on the archipelago. However, since they lived on an island far away, the British did not learn of their existence until several months later. But the settlers of both nations coexisted peacefully at first. But when Spain heard of the occupation of the islands, it immediately asked both nations to recall their settlers. The entire South Atlantic was Spanish territory, and they would not tolerate bases of other nations. The French then retreated, but not so the British. Spain therefore invaded the islands shortly after and conquered the British settlement. However, when Britain threatened them with a war in Europe, they quickly withdrew and handed the islands back to the British settlers, leaving only a few Spanish settlers behind. But over the next few decades, both nations became involved in major wars. First Britain in the American War of Independence, and then both nations in the Napoleonic Wars. Both nations then evacuated the Falkland Islands as they could no longer afford to occupy them so far from home, and the islands were again left uninhabited. Over the next decades, whalers and pirates from various nations settled there. Also, some settlers from the newly independent Argentina came to the island. The Argentine government took advantage of this, sent soldiers, and then raised its flag on the islands. But this eventually went too far for the British. For them, the islands were still British property, and they began an invasion of the islands in 1833. However, since the Argentines mutinied against their own commanders, the British were able to conquer the islands without a fight. Thus, over the next few decades, a peaceful period began and more British settled on the islands. This only changed with the Second World War. A pro-fascist government came to power in Argentina, which began to make claims to the islands again. The plan of a conquest was then discussed again and again in Argentine politics, and in 1982 it was actually put into action. On April the 1st, the Argentine military government invaded the islands and conquered them completely. They did not expect any counterattack from the British, since the islands were too far from home and were relatively insignificant. But they did not count on the British Prime Minister of the time, Margaret Thatcher. She wanted to keep the islands at all costs. For the British, the islands were a symbol of national pride, and they wanted to demonstrate their military strength and show that they were still an important player on the international stage. So only a few days later, a fleet of 36 warships and a total of 5,000 men left for the South Atlantic. In addition, air raids began on the island's capital, Port Stanley. And within 6 weeks, the British were able to recapture the islands and the Argentines were forced to surrender. In total, the war cost the lives of 712 Argentine and 256 British soldiers. To this day, the government of Argentina and the United Kingdom continue to clash over the islands. The Argentines invoke UN law of decolonization and call the islands a remnant of the era of British imperialism. The British argue that the islands never really belonged to Argentina and put the right of self-determination of the peoples first. So they held a referendum in which the nearly 3,000 islanders voted to remain a British overseas territory. Argentina, on the other hand, argues that the Falklanders are not a people in their own right and that the vote is therefore null and void. The conflict is still not completely resolved and the two governments continue to clash. That was it with the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're furthermore interested in colonial clashes, I recommend you my last video where I talked about the Russian colony in California. Enjoy the video and see you next time.